Hello and welcome to Weekly News Highlights. Let's begin with the keywords that made headlines this week. Iran has entered a new leadership era after Mojtaba Khamenei was named as the country's new supreme leader. But fighting with the United States and Israel continues to intensify, with President Donald Trump saying the war will only end when Washington decides. President Lee Jae-myung hosted Ghanaian President John Mahama for talks on Wednesday. Strengthening cooperation in trade, critical minerals, and maritime security topped the agenda. South Korea's National Assembly has passed a key bill aimed at managing the country's massive investment plan in the United States. The move established a legal framework needed to carry out a $350 billion commitment under a bilateral trade deal with Washington. President Lee Jae-myung has called for heightened preparedness as tensions in the Middle East persist. During Tuesday's cabinet meeting, he also raised the possibility of a supplementary budget to help ease pressure on the domestic economy. Our Blue House correspondent Song Yujin reports.
As tensions in the Middle East enter their second week following the U.S. military strikes on Iran, President Lee Jae-myung told his cabinet that their role is more critical than ever.
과거 어느 때보다도 더 절박하게 또 충실하게 최선을 다하면 지금의 상황을 더 나은 상황으로 만들 수 있다.
Presiding over a cabinet meeting on Tuesday, Lee said stabilizing prices is the government's most urgent task as uncertainty grows in energy supplies, logistics, and financial markets. The government plans to introduce a temporary price ceiling on petroleum products within the week. President Lee instructed the finance minister to ensure the measure minimizes the burden on customers.
생산 원가가 올랐다. 그거 하면 그 시점에는 다시 또 최고 가격을 변경해야 되는데 기존에 이미 한 열흘 이상 이렇게 이미 올려받은 부분, 그 부분을 고려해서 실제 유가가 오르더라도 그때 바로 최고 가격을 올리지 말고.
Lee proposed imposing a price cap during last week's extraordinary cabinet meeting. He warned of possible price gouging by oil refiners, citing rising fuel prices despite South Korea holding petroleum reserves equivalent to 7 months of supply. The Fair Trade Commission has launched an investigation into possible collusion among refiners. The president even mentioned preparing a supplementary budget to ease the burden on consumers if the Middle East situation drags on.
We could consider cutting fuel taxes on gasoline by another 10% or increasing direct support. A combination of such measures could help ease polarization while protecting people's livelihoods.
이번 어차피 조기에 추경을 해야 될 상황인 것 같으니까. 지금 재정 지원이나 소상공인 지원이나 뭐 한계 기업들 지원인 뭐 등등 할래도 좀 추가의 재정이.
South Korea currently maintains a 7% tax cut on gasoline, with the maximum reduction capped at 37%. These discussions come as the Blue House has designated this week as an all-out response week to address developments in the Middle East, with a focus on public safety and economic stability. Song Yujin, Arirang News.
President Lee Jae-myung welcomed Ghanaian leader John Mahama to Seoul on Wednesday, with the two sides pledging to strengthen ties spanning trade, critical minerals, and maritime security. Our senior Blue House correspondent Yoon Jung-min reports.
Bolstering the partnership was the focal point as President Lee Jae-myung hosted his Ghanaian counterpart, John Mahama, noting the two countries' shared experiences of achieving democracy and the increasing trade volume.
서아프리카 3개국과 국경을 맞대고 있는 해양국 가나는 대한민국의 아프리카 시장 진출을 잇는 든든한 교두보이기도 합니다. 그리고 최근에는 매우 큰 규모의 벼 재배 단지를 함께 조성해서 내년부터 한국산 벼 종자를 생산할 예정으로 있습니다.
Ghana, like other African countries, has a potential for critical minerals. And so currently we're exploiting bauxite, manganese, and gold. And we've discovered vast reserves of lithium. Korea has the technology, and we believe that we can explore these minerals together.
Maritime security was also high on the agenda.
가나는 해적 위협이 상존하는 기니만에서 우리 대한민국 국민들의 안전을 지키는데 그동안 적극적으로 협조해 준 참으로 고마운 나라이기도 합니다.
The issue of piracy is of major concern to Korea, just as it is to Ghana. And so I'm happy that one of the memorandums we're going to sign is to do with maritime safety.
MOUs were signed on Wednesday for cooperation not only on maritime security, but also on technology and science, as well as joint tackling of climate change. There was a friendly atmosphere as the leaders touched upon a link between the two countries, represented by Ghana Chocolate, a chocolate bar made from Ghanaian cocoa that was launched in Korea more than 50 years ago. Yi has presented Mahama with the chocolate, who's on a working visit to South Korea. The sentiment was extended to cultural and people-to-people exchanges.
가나 현지에서도 영화, 식품, 화장품 같은 우리 문화가 큰 사랑을 받고 있다고 알고 있습니다.
When I was coming, somebody asked me to bring them back kimchi. And our young people, including my children, listen to K-pop music.
Seoul's top office added that the leaders also addressed regional and global issues, including the Middle East, and said it hoped to expand the nation's diplomatic horizons. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
In response to the ongoing tariff risks raised by the Trump administration, South Korea's National Assembly passed a U.S. Investment Special Act that lays out the details for Seoul's U.S.-bound investment. The National Assembly finalized a deal this week, and for more details, we have our political correspondent Ang Sung-jin with us in the studio today. Welcome, Sung-jin.
Thanks for having me, Soo-jin.
So, Sung-jin, this special bill has been passed with bipartisan support. Can you explain to us what this bill is to start us off?
Right, so the National Assembly passed a legislation aimed at managing and accelerating the large-scale Korean investment in the United States. The Special Act on Strategic Investment Management between Korea and the U.S., often referred to as the U.S. Investment Special Act, passed the plenary session with bipartisan support on Thursday, March 12th, with 226 votes in favor, 8 against, and 8 abstentions. What this law entails is that it is designed to implement a Korea-U.S. MOU where Seoul plans to invest $350 billion in the United States. Now, to oversee the effort, the legislation calls for the creation of the Korea-U.S. Strategic Investment Corporation, which will be fully funded by the government with 2 trillion won, or $1.36 billion in capital. The fund is set to support investments in projects including joint shipbuilding corporation and other strategic initiatives. To mitigate potential financial and legal risks, the legislation also mandates the creation of a risk management committee. Investment decisions, including project projection, funding amounts, and timing, will all be handled by a Korea-U.S. Strategic Investment Corporation's committee within the corporation, which is to be chaired by the finance minister. Before the government begins negotiations with the U.S. on any proposed project, it will have to report the plan in advance to the relevant National Assembly Committee for Parliamentary Oversight.
I see. So what has the process been like? I know the proceedings haven't always gone smoothly.
Right, so the first ruling Democratic Party had first introduced the bill back in November 26th last year, making it 106 days for the legislation to be enacted since it was first proposed. Now, the bill represents a compromise version that integrates 9 previously proposed bills, reflecting input from both ruling and opposition parties as well as the government. Now, its passage comes after weeks of political friction. The special committee's work had stalled earlier amid opposition protests over the ruling party's unilateral pushing of other bills, such as judicial reform. This legislation in particular gained urgency after U.S. President Donald Trump warned in January that tariffs on South Korean goods could revert to 25% if Seoul continued delaying the legislation needed to implement the bilateral investment agreement.
And now that this bill has been passed, what can we expect to see next?
The legislation cleared through the National Assembly's Legislation and Judiciary Committee and received final approval, so the authorities can now move quickly to finalize the investments and coordinate with their U.S. counterparts to maximize both tangible and intangible support from Washington. Even before the law formally takes effect, the government has begun preliminary reviews of potential projects through an interim task force. The new law is expected to provide a backbone for one of the largest overseas investment initiatives undertaken by South Korea. However, tariff uncertainty remains after the United States announced it had launched a Section 301 trade investigation into 16 economies, including South Korea, China, Japan, and the European Union. Attention is now turning to whether the law could help ease ongoing tariff risks in trade relations between the two countries, as Trump has repeatedly hinted at the possibility of higher tariffs amid delays in creating Seoul's investment framework.
All right, thank you so much for your coverage today, Seongjin.
My pleasure as always, Sujin.
Iran has named a new supreme leader following the death of Ali Khamenei, with the country's powerful clerical body appointing his son Mojtaba Khamenei to the post. Our Kim Do-yeon has more.
Iran's Assembly of Experts has named Mojtaba Khamenei as the country's new supreme leader, cementing hardline control in Tehran as the conflict with the United States and Israel intensifies. The widely expected move was officially announced just after midnight Monday in Tehran. The 88-member clerical body appointed Mojtaba to succeed his father, Ali Khamenei, who was killed over a week ago.
The esteemed members of the Assembly of Experts appoint and introduce Ayatollah Sayyid Mojtaba Hosseini Khamenei, may God preserve him, as the third leader of the sacred system of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
As a mid-ranking cleric with deep ties to Iran's security apparatus and extensive business networks, the new Ayatollah holds the absolute final say on all state matters in the Islamic Republic. Anticipating the appointment, United States President Donald Trump issued a preemptive warning on Sunday. Speaking to ABC News before the official announcement, Trump stated that any new Iranian leader must receive U.S. approval or risk being swiftly removed. He has also called Khamenei a lightweight when reports arose about the appointment. The ongoing conflict continues to result in casualties on multiple fronts. U.S. Central Command announced the death of a 7th American service member. The individual succumbed to injuries sustained during an Iranian attack on U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia on March 1st. Meanwhile, the Sharan oil depot in Tehran continues to burn following Israeli strikes on fuel facilities over the weekend. Iran's oil distribution company reported the deaths of 4 employees and announced temporary fuel rationing. The Iranian Foreign Ministry condemned the strikes as a war crime, accusing Israel of releasing toxic substances into civilian areas. The Israeli military stated the depots are legal military targets used to store and produce propellant for ballistic missiles, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowing to continue the assault without mercy. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The standoff between the United States and Iran continues to deepen. Both sides insist they will decide how and when the war ends, with no clear path to a resolution. An Seong-jin reports.
U.S. President Donald Trump said the ongoing situation in Iran could end, quote, whenever I want. In a phone interview with Axios on Wednesday, he insisted the military campaign was going very well and that the U.S. forces were ahead of schedule.
We don't want to leave early, do we? We got to finish the job, right? Over the past 11 days, our military has virtually destroyed Iran.
The White House also emphasized that the operation would only end when Trump determines that the military objectives have been fully achieved. According to U.S. media outlets that cited a closed-door Senate briefing, the U.S. Department of Defense has estimated that the first 6 days of war against Iran cost more than $11.3 billion US. With the estimate yet to include other cost categories, the total is expected to be significantly higher. Israel, fighting alongside the U.S., stated that it will not impose a time limit on its campaign until all objectives are achieved and victory is secured. However, Iranian officials rejected the idea that Washington can unilaterally decide when the conflict ends.
I have repeatedly warned Trump, you can start a war, but we will decide how it ends.
Iran has reportedly rejected 2 ceasefire messages delivered through Trump's envoy. According to The Guardian, the internal consensus among Iran's leadership largely favors continuing the fight for now, with officials believing the regime can endure the conflict. The president of Iran said he held talks with the leaders of Russia and Pakistan to reaffirm Iran's commitment to regional peace and outline conditions to end the war, which include firm international guarantees to prevent future attacks. Meanwhile, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has claimed responsibility for attacks on vessels attempting to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. There have also been reports of attacks on oil tankers in Iraqi waters near Basra, around 800 kilometers away from the strait. Though officials have not formally identified the attacker, initial investigations cited by Reuters suggest the tankers were struck by explosives-laden boats from Iran. At least 15 vessels in the area have been attacked since the beginning of hostilities, with Iran continuing to threaten to block all oil shipments through the waterway. The U.S. has warned of possible airstrikes on civilian ports as retaliatory measures. With the Strait of Hormuz being one of the world's most critical energy corridors, fears are mounting that global energy prices could surge if the strait remains closed. An Song-jin, Arirang News.
North Korea's Kim Yo-jong has condemned ongoing annual South Korea-U.S. military drills, calling them a rehearsal for war that undermines regional security. Our defense correspondent Kim Bo-kyung reports.
Kim Yo-jong, the sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and a department director of the ruling Workers' Party of Korea, warned on Tuesday about the joint military drills between South Korea and the U.S. In a statement carried by the Korean Central News Agency, she said hostile forces' military demonstrations near the regime's sovereign and security areas could lead to unimaginably terrible consequences. Calling the drills a provocative and aggressive war rehearsal, Kim said that regardless of any justification or adjustments, the exercise remains a large-scale, high-intensity war drill. Citing current global geopolitical crises and international conflicts, she added that such actions by enemy states should be met not with proportional responses, but with an overwhelmingly powerful and preemptive offensive. An expert said the remarks appear to be sending a message to the U.S. after it strikes on Iran.
It warns about the U.S.-South Korea joint military exercises, but indirectly it is also sending a message that, unlike Iran, North Korea would immediately retaliate with nuclear weapons if attacked.
Referring to what North Korean leader Kim Jong-un previously said, his sister again stressed the regime's law and iron principle that the strongest offensive capability is the most reliable deterrent. The expert added that while there could be provocations during the drills, they are unlikely to be serious.
It indirectly suggests that North Korea may stage a show of force if U.S. strategic assets are deployed to the Korean peninsula during the joint exercises. The provocation would most likely be launching a ballistic missile, with stronger provocation like an ICBM considered less likely.
South Korea and the U.S. began the annual springtime joint drills, Freedom Shield, starting Monday. The number of troops participating in the exercise is similar to last year, though the number of field training exercises has more than halved to 22 from 51 last year. Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
North Korea says it carried out another strategic cruise missile launch from a naval warship with leader Kim Jong-un and his daughter present. Yoon-jin has the details.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has once again observed the test firing of strategic cruise missiles from the Chaehyun, a 5,000-ton multi-purpose destroyer. The launches came as Seoul and Washington kicked off their annual joint military exercise Freedom Shield on Monday, which the North has long denounced despite them being defensive in nature. According to a report from the North state media, the Korean Central News Agency, on Wednesday, the tests took place on Tuesday and were observed by Kim Jong-un via video. The KCNA said multiple cruise missiles were launched in quick succession along flight trajectories set over the Yellow Sea and flew for just under 3 hours before striking designated targets. Kim expressed satisfaction that the tests verified the reliability of the National Integrated Control System for Strategic Weapons and the superiority of the destroyer's integrated combat system. But Kim raised the need to test the efficiency of the automatic guns installed on the warship and presented tasks for strengthening the regime's naval power, adding that it is more advantageous to enhance capabilities by equipping high-speed warships of less than 3,000 tons with guns and to install supersonic weapon systems instead of guns on the 5,000 and 8,000-ton destroyers. Similar strategic cruise missile launches were conducted earlier this month, ahead of the Chaehyun's commissioning, which Kim had observed from the site alone. What is notable about the launches on Tuesday is that, based on the photos released, Kim's daughter Chue was also seen overseeing the launch. This continues recent elevated public images of Kim Ju-ae, including the latest display of photos on a billboard at the North Korean embassy in Beijing's Chaoyang district. While this board is a space that showcases North Korea's official public image in China, photos are known to have been updated irregularly, about 3 to 4 times a year. However, following the change of the photos in February, which were centered on former leader Kim Jong-il ahead of his date of birth, known as the Day of the Shining Star in the North, the photos were changed out again in March to include ones featuring Kim Ju-ae. 이은진, Arirang News.
Authorities are joining international efforts while also exploring domestic measures to address the impact of the Middle East situation on energy markets. Our correspondent Park Jun-an explains.
South Korea plans to release 22.46 million barrels of oil from its strategic reserves as part of a coordinated action by member countries of the International Energy Agency aimed at stabilizing global energy markets. The plan was announced on Wednesday by the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Resources shortly after the 32-member nations of the Paris-based agency unanimously agreed to carry out the largest collective oil stock release in the organization's history. In total, about 400 million barrels of oil will be made available to the market in an effort to ease supply disruptions and curb rising crude prices linked to the ongoing war involving the United States and Israel against Iran. Korea's contribution represents about 5.6% of the total to be released. The size of each country's release is calculated based on its share of overall oil consumption among IEA members. The U.S. Energy Department also issued a press release saying the administration would release 172 million barrels of oil from its reserves. Officials say the timing and detailed schedule of the coordinated release will be determined in the coming days. The decision comes as global oil markets continue to show volatility despite expectations of increased supply. Oil prices surged for a second consecutive day. On Wednesday, Brent crude rose 4.8% to around $92 per barrel on the Intercontinental Exchange in London. As of Thursday, 3:30 p.m. Korean Standard Time, it is trading at about $98.2, up 6.75% in just a few hours. WTI crude also climbed 4.6% to settle at around $87 per barrel on the New York Mercantile Exchange. And as of the same time on Thursday, it had risen to over $93, gaining more than 6.6%. As oil supply chain risks persist and oil prices continue to climb, the government announced planned market stabilization measures. The first possibility is a supplementary budget dedicated to those who are highly vulnerable to oil price hikes. If introduced, an additional budget of up to 15 to 20 trillion won, or around 10 to 13.5 billion dollars, could be allocated. The funding could be used to expand the scope of fuel tax reductions, provide oil price-linked support for low-income workers, expand energy voucher assistance, offer subsidies for the transportation industry, including trucks and buses, and support export-oriented small and medium-sized enterprises. A temporary price cap on domestic oil is another option the government will announce. According to its own guidelines, appropriate price levels that the government thinks ideal would be at 1,800 won per liter, or around $1.22. However, the price level would be reviewed every 2 weeks to reflect any changes in global oil prices. With more details to follow, Finance Minister Koo Yoon-chul said the government will mobilize all available policy tools and activate an emergency economic response system to address the situation in real time. Park Jun-an, Arirang News.
At the 2026 Winter Paralympics in Italy, Team Korea is exceeding expectations, already bringing home gold, silver, and bronze. Jung Hae-rim has the highlights.
South Korea has now secured a full set of gold, silver, and bronze medals at the Milano Cortina Winter Paralympics, surpassing its initial medal target of 1 gold and 1 silver. A major contributor to that success is 19-year-old cross-country skier Kim Yoon-ji. Kim captured silver in the women's sitting sprint final with a time of 3 minutes and 10 seconds, finishing just behind American Oksana Masters. The medal marks Kim's second of the Games. Earlier this week, she made history by winning gold in the women's biathlon, becoming the first Korean woman to win a gold medal at the Winter Paralympics.
Kim competes as a dual-season athlete, swimming in the summer and skiing in the winter. And despite her young age, she has quickly emerged as one of South Korea's most promising Paralympic athletes. The 19-year-old still has 3 events remaining at the Games, raising hopes she could add more medals before the competition concludes. There was also success in the curling rink. The world #1 wheelchair curling mixed doubles duo Baek Hye-jin and Lee Yong-seok defeated the United States 6-3 in the semifinals. The team secured an early lead and never allowed a comeback, guaranteeing at least a silver medal. This milestone marks South Korea's first Paralympic medal in wheelchair curling in 16 years, dating back to the 2010 Vancouver Games. The duo will face a powerhouse team from China for the gold medal later on Wednesday. Meanwhile, the 4-person mixed curling team also remains in strong contention, currently sitting in 3rd place in the preliminaries after a dominant 9-0 victory over Norway. With several events still ahead, South Korea's athletes are continuing to build momentum at the Paralympic Games. 정혜림, Arirang News.
That brings us to the end of Weekly News Highlights. Thank you for watching and enjoy the rest of your weekend.